work and of the look at Heshmat as the people's sculptor and a glance at themes in Heshmat's works, ending with the Hassan Heshmat Museum and a note on his legacy and his relevance today, just so you have an idea of the themes of this evening's lecture. This talk explores the work of Egyptian sculptor Hassan Heshmat, contextualizing his practice historically, focusing really on his use of porcelain, a radical medium for its time, to depict everyday life in Egypt, reflecting broader themes in his sculptural practice, including his engagement with national identity. Dubbed the people's sculptor, Heshmat used accessible materials to create art that spoke to and for ordinary people. His museum in Cairo, housed in his former home, stands as a testament to his wide-ranging practice. Under the leadership of the Egyptian fine arts sector, it remains one of a handful of artists' house museums in Egypt. In the context of this exhibition at the Divan, his legacy deserves a closer look today. In his own words, translated from the original Arabic, Heshmat was an Egyptian ceramicist and sculptor who carved his path through stone, remaining steadfast in expressing his Egyptian identity and nationalism through his work and in the dozens of exhibitions he held in Egypt and abroad. This is an excerpt of the 1981 documentary The World of the Artist Hassan Heshmat. I'll just play this briefly. Heshmat's practice spanned over 6 decades and contributed significantly to modern art in Egypt and beyond. Born in Monofia, Heshmat graduated from the Department of Ceramics at the School of Applied Arts in 1938, and he later earned a diploma from the Higher Institute of Art Education for Teachers in 1954. And it was in 1958 that he pursued advanced studies in porcelain at the Academy of Fine Porcelain Arts in Selb in West Germany, which was a formative experience that shaped his approach to material and form. Another excerpt here. In these clips, we see Heshmat perhaps at the height of his practice. He was quite old at this point, and he's practicing in his home, which is now his museum. And you can see the extent to which his practice is quite bodily and involved. Over the course of his career, Heshmat received major national and international recognition. He held numerous solo exhibitions in Egypt and internationally, including in London, Paris, Rome, Geneva, Stockholm, Lausanne, as well as in Syria and Hungary. And he participated in many significant group exhibitions all over the world. His awards include the State Appreciation Award in Egypt, the gold and silver medals from ceramics competitions in Italy, and the first prize for a public monument in Belgium, among others. Best known for his pioneering work in ceramics, Heshmat was instrumental in introducing small format porcelain sculptures that conveyed distinctly Egyptian themes and identities. These works became widely distributed in Egyptian homes from the 1960s through the 1980s, before his practice shifted toward medium and large scale public sculptures. He was drawn to art from a very young age, and he remembers making small-scale sculptures from the silt of the Nile at the young age of 10. He described how they would make him very happy and how he would occupy himself with making them in his free time. His classical training at the Egyptian School of Fine Arts resulted in perhaps more figurative works, such as these self-portraits in his earlier career trajectory. Now they hang in his office at his house museum. Heshmat trained with Said al-Sadr, who was considered the first true pioneer of modern ceramic art in Egypt. Al-Sadr notably earned a diploma from the Camberwell School of Art in London, where he trained with the British studio potter and art teacher Bernard Leach, regarded as the father of British studio pottery. So, in turn, Al-Sadr's guidance shaped Heshmat's practice. In an interview, Heshmat speaks to the impact that he had on his practice as a mentor. We had a great mentor, the artist Said al-Sadr, he said. He is the reason I became who I am. He taught us to love art and work. He took us weekly to the Egyptian Museum, the Islamic Museum, and the Coptic Museum. He also brought us into nature. He planted in us a love for drawing life, landscapes, and our surroundings. I lived and breathed the Egyptian Museum. Every time I entered, I saw something new. Until recently, I would make pilgrimage to it every 2 or 3 weeks. I know the weight of that expression because the museum holds the treasures of our civilization and the deep expressive artistry of our ancient Egyptian ancestors, art that influenced all world civilizations. I think it's worth noting here that it's not just Sadr that shared this philosophy when it came to teaching art, particular applied arts, which Heshmat was studying, or the art of sculpture in general. I would say that this remains a tradition that's taught today. Students are taken to the Egyptian Museum. That's how they learn the formal qualities of sculpture. I personally was trained in sculpture at the American University in Cairo by a professor who took us to the Egyptian Museum and made us observe sculptures and sketch them and kind of use that as a basis for which to learn the formal visual language of sculpture and how to apply that to contemporary art. Heshmat belongs to a generation of artists who were instrumental in shaping the language of modern Egyptian art. To situate him within this context, I began by looking into his peers. In one of his earliest group exhibitions, he showed alongside seminal figures such as Raghib Ayed, Gamal al-Sagini, Abdelhadi Ghazar, and Saad Kamel. Described as the liberator of modern Egyptian art, Raghib Ayed was widely recognized as the founding father of the Egyptian popular expressionist movement. Ayed was one of the most innovative painters of his generation and one of the most respected in the Arab world. The subjects of Ayed's works often drew from ancient Egyptian references and Egyptian popular culture, depicting scenes of rural life. Gamal al-Sagini was a celebrated Egyptian sculptor, painter, and a medalist, and he was perhaps best known for his socialist realist works, sculpted across a variety of mediums. Sagini's works similarly often drew from ancient Egyptian subjects, popular folk subjects, and more political and figurative subjects, and he can be seen here in a photograph with one of his works. And Hassan Heshmat stands in the background. You can see him over here, if you can see my cursor. Abdelhadi Ghazar was a prominent Egyptian painter and a key figure in the country's modernist art movement. He was known for his unique expressionist style, incorporating elements of folklore, religious symbolism, and social commentary into his work. And so this is Saad al-Kamel was considered a pioneer of modern folk art, and he produced works largely in batik and in textile paintings, graphics, weaving, and stained glass. He was also a student of applied arts like Heshmat. And in this kind of generation of artists, and you can imagine with me that group exhibition because I haven't been able to find photographs of it yet. But you can imagine with me the kind of themes that would have emerged in that exhibition and what his peers were concerned with. Looking at Heshmat's practice more broadly within the history of modern art in Egypt, his work aligns with the trajectory of artistic production concerned with developing a distinctly Egyptian visual language, one rooted in local realities and expressive of national identity. Central to this trajectory was a desire to depict everyday Egyptian subjects, particularly figures from the popular classes. In this regard, Heshmat's focus on the Egyptian woman resonates with broader currents in modern Egyptian art. Artists such as Mahmoud Said, often described as the father of modernism in Egypt, pioneered this interest through his stylized portrayals of Egyptian women, and there's many, many depictions of women of all kinds of classes. While painters like Inji Aflatun and Gazbeya Sirri offered an equally powerful yet distinct contribution through their representations shaped by the female gaze. Together, these artists formed a complex and evolving dialogue around gender, class, and nationhood in modern Egyptian visual culture, one in which Heshmat's work can be meaningfully situated. Heshmat's oeuvre sits firmly within the canon of modern sculpture in Egypt. His work follows a lineage that begins with Mahmoud Mukhtar, widely regarded as the father of modern Egyptian sculpture. Mukhtar's expansive body of work, ranging from monumental public works like Nahdat Masr to more intimate pieces, helped establish a sculptural language grounded in Egyptian themes and forms, the one that has continued to inspire generations of sculptors. Alongside this lineage, figures such as Abd al-Badi' Abd al-Hayy emerged with distinctive voices of their own. Discovered while working as Huda Sha'rawi's cook, Abd al-Hayy went on to produce largely figurative works that depicted Egyptian subjects and drew inspiration from ancient Egyptian aesthetics. Gamal al-Saghini's sculptures, though often aligned with socialist realism, similarly engaged deeply with Egyptian themes and imagery. Adam Hanin, meanwhile, abstracted the visual language of ancient Egyptian sculpture into a minimalist and modern idiom uniquely his own. While these artists were shaped by their individual training, environments, and shared cultural references, each of them developed a sculptural language that was entirely their own. Heshmat's practice can be situated within this broader field, contributing to and expanding the discourse of Egyptian modernism through a visual language grounded in local subjects and personal vision. Heshmat's first exhibition was in 1953 at the Aladdin Gallery in Cairo, under the auspices of then President Mohammed Naguib. At this exhibition, Saeed al-Sadr, his mentor and the master ceramicist of Egypt at the time, introduced him, saying, "This is a wonderful opportunity to present to the public and art lovers the ceramicist Hassan Heshmat, one of the pioneers striving to revive this art in Egypt after its long slumber. Ceramics, unlike other applied arts, is distinguished by the persistence, patience, strength, and determination it demands in facing challenges and solving many practical, artistic, and scientific problems." In his autobiography, Heshmat lists a number of his exhibitions, accompanied by reflections from prominent attendees, critics, artists, and cultural practitioners alike. What struck me was his inclusion of an account by Sheikh Ali Farrog, whom he described simply as an Egyptian citizen. "I saw the artifacts of our pharaonic ancestors who stood out to the whole world in all forms of art. I was amazed and fascinated by what I saw. But at the same time, I felt sadness and regret that these works ceased with the disappearance of their creators. Then came the artist Hassan Heshmat, who reconnected what had been severed and completed what was missing. With the spirit of the Egyptian and his culture, his masterpiece speaks with every noble meaning. May God reward you well, for you revived our art and restored our glory in a form that truly compensated us for our ancient artists." In a sense, for me, this quote and its inclusion really speak to Heshmat's practice, its reception by the Egyptian public, but also the importance of that testimony of an Egyptian citizen, as he wrote, receiving his work. For him, it was as equally important as a critic, a minister of culture, and his artistic peers. As a sculptor, Heshmat worked on a monumental scale. His large public commissions including site-specific works in Cairo, Malmo, Boston, and Manama, combine symbolic national motifs with a formal clarity that draws from both Islamic and modernist aesthetics. It's precisely his work in such a monumental scale that made his work in porcelain so revolutionary. First, because he learned the technique in Selb in West Germany and introduced it to Egypt, where it was otherwise largely unfamiliar to artists. And second, because of his commitment to making art accessible to the average Egyptian citizen, creating works that were deliberately approachable in size, medium, and price. He described his major goal as that of bringing art into most areas of people's lives, what he described as art for the millions. This feature in Al Gil magazine in 1961 shows Heshmat with some of his porcelain figurines upon his return from Italy, where he represented the United Arab Republic at the Mostra Internazionale della Ceramica at Gualdo Tadino, where he won a silver medal and a diploma for Egypt's participation. His works are described as the sculptures of our country, reflecting how his depictions of popular Egyptian subjects resonated deeply with the Egyptian public. In April 1962, Heshmat signed a contract with the Arab Airlines company, Egypt Air, to produce large quantities of small porcelain sculptures to be distributed to first-class passengers on its international flights. This collaboration lasted for about 15 years, during which his works entered people's homes across much of the world. During that time, he created a large stone facade and a major stone statue for the interior and exterior of the company's office in Paris. He also created facades with large ceramic murals for its offices in Berlin, Geneva, Lagos, and other locations. According to Heshmat, every traveler from Egypt would take a sculpture as a souvenir of their visit. He described the process of producing the works, saying, I design a statue and then produce 500 or even 1,000 pieces from it. The first piece is a complete artwork in every respect, and therefore every copy carries the same qualities. What matters to me is spreading the artistic culture to as many people as possible. Some of my works are priced starting from just 30 piasters. Heshmat's choice to work with porcelain was more than a technical or aesthetic decision. It was a deliberate political gesture. In a cultural landscape where monumental sculpture often symbolized national pride, but somehow remained largely inaccessible to the general public, his porcelain works challenged traditional hierarchies of art consumption. By producing affordable, reproducible sculptures that depicted popular Egyptian subjects, Heshmat sought to democratize art, making it available to the everyday citizen rather than an elite few. This approach not only reclaimed national identity through familiar cultural imagery, but also contested the exclusivity of fine art, transforming sculpture into a medium of shared cultural ownership and public participation. In this way, his porcelain sculptures became acts of social engagement, bridging the gap between art, politics, and everyday life in Egypt. A 1963 feature in Al Kawakib magazine shows Hassan Heshmat with the contemporary dancers Mahmoud Rida and Farida Fahmi. In it, they're seen with Heshmat in his home studio, and they're mimicking the forms of dance in each of the sculptural works. In this photograph on the right here, for instance, Farida Fahmi poses like the Fallaha figure depicted in one of Heshmat's sculptures. Beyond demonstrating the movement and rhythmic qualities that are inherent in Heshmat's sculptures, the feature also highlights the accessibility of his oeuvre and the way his art resonated across different creative disciplines. Heshmat's sculptural practice is characterized by a sensitive negotiation between historical reference and contemporary form. He sought somehow to forge a link between the aesthetics of Islamic ceramics from the Fatimid era and what were seen at the time as prevailing trends in the global art market. In his treatment of form, he oscillates between deliberate simplification and purposeful exaggeration, distorting proportions to heighten expression and create rhythm within the sculptural silhouette. Sorry. Most of his porcelain works, while similar in subject matter to his broader oeuvre, are unique in their simplified and streamlined abstract visual language, contrasting with the more detailed figurative sculptures that he created on a larger scale in clay and stone. Some porcelain works, however, replicate larger scale monumental sculptures and recurring motifs, again featuring Egyptian subjects, particularly the fallah and the fallaha, but rendered in a more detailed and figurative technique. Here I'd like to draw a comparison to Mahmoud Mukhtar, who similarly depicted the Egyptian fallaha and employed simplified lines to create a language of abstract figuration. However, Mukhtar sculpted primarily in marble and stone, materials that rendered his work less accessible and largely limited to those who could physically access it or afford it. In contrast, Heshmat developed his own interpretation of the same subject with the explicit goal of producing it in a medium, porcelain, that could reach as many Egyptian homes as possible. A celebrated artist, Heshmat's work received widespread recognition in both Egyptian and international press. His porcelain sculptures, in particular, were praised for fulfilling his intention of making art accessible to a broad Egyptian public. One notable feature, titled A Ceramic Sculpture for Every House, highlights both Heshmat's creative process and technique, as well as the trajectory of his works. We're going to take a look at themes in Heshmat's works. I'm just going to pause for a second. These works you can see here are all taken from images that I photographed my last visit to Hassan Heshmat's museum in Cairo. And they all depict a variety of his works across different scales. Some of these are larger scale works seen in the outdoor sculptural garden. Others are smaller scale, sculpted and placed on plinths within the museum itself. Many of them depict themes of family, scenes of a mother and child, or a mother, a father, and a child, or a more nuclear family here with a mother, father, son, and a daughter. All depicting rural Egyptian subjects, mostly from their dress, we can guess that they are fallahin. The formal language of his works draw from ancient Egyptian sculpture, adopting a modernist approach that blends stylized figuration with abstraction and simplification of forms. And if we look closely at these different examples here, I've drawn from, again, examples that we can see at his house museum in Cairo. This is a more large-scale depiction of two fallahin, women carrying large, I would say these would usually be trays made of clay or straw or something that they would be used to hold some form of food on top of their heads, or if they're working in the fields, then some kind of harvest. And with this kind of more relief work, the language is actually closer to his porcelain works in the way the figures have been abstracted, in the way that the faces are removed, and the lines of each of the characters and figures are simplified and streamlined. Whereas a smaller scale work, such as this one found in his office, shows the same approach that he takes with some of his more monumental sculptural commissions that employ the language of ancient Egyptian sculpture, here incorporating symbolism on the base of the sculpture and the ways in which the figures are sculpted, but seen on a smaller scale. Heshmat also produced numerous works featuring Arabic calligraphy, many of which incorporated verses from the Quran. These pieces are rendered in bold, stylized script and vivid colors, all executed in ceramics for the most part. Some of them he produced in wood. And here, these works are extremely characteristic of his distinctive technique, both in terms of the approach to the formal language itself, but then also the color and the um, technical treatment of the surface. As demonstrated by this still from the documentary on Heshmat's work, he worked across a variety of mediums and scales. Among these, he produced several wooden sculptures exploring similar themes. Here we can see a family of fallahin whose faces are intentionally omitted, with bold lines emphasizing an abstracted figuration. And he produced these works across multiple scales. This particular work comes from a private collection in, I'm forgetting from where, I think Sweden, if I had to guess. Upon researching Heshmat, I learned that his daughter, Suhair Heshmat, was also an artist at just 13 years old. Suhair produced a series of works that were exhibited alongside her father's in several of his exhibitions. She signed her works Kuku Hassan Heshmat, and as a result, there remains some confusion around the authorship of his works and the distinction between his and hers today. Many of Suhair's works are produced in a similar approach and technique to her father's. She imitates many of the subjects that he takes in his own works. And when asked about her practice in an interview in the children's magazine, Samir, she spoke about being inspired by ancient Egyptian sculpture and Egyptian subjects, and speaking to the references that her father was inspired by. But then she also cited her father being a sculptor as the reason that she became interested in making art, and cited his own practice as a source of inspiration. And I think it's quite revolutionary also for that period for a father to carve out space within his own exhibition for his daughter to show works, and for him to have done that multiple times as well. And it's interesting that she continued to produce work, though she's not that well known or acclaimed. And I would say that the main issue remains the confusion around the authorship of her works and his, and I'd be curious to explore that more in my own research. In addition to his studio practice, Heshmat contributed significantly to Egypt's cultural infrastructure. He turned his home into a museum and established an open-air museum in his garden. Alongside the structure of the museum itself, that includes numerous sculptures, a ceramics workshop, and a gallery. The latter was inaugurated in 1998 by then Minister for Culture Abdel Hatem and remains an important site for local and international cultural engagement. For Heshmat himself, the establishment of this museum was another way to achieve his goal to make art accessible to as many people as possible. His goal was for the children of the neighborhood to be able to experience art, to be able to come in and have workshops and experience his works and learn from them. And it was actually in that same spirit that he first approached Egypt's Ministry for Culture when he was still a young artist, still starting out. And he reached out to introduce them to his work so that he could introduce it into Egyptian curriculums. And it was then that the Egyptian state acquired the first selection of his works and began to take his practice seriously and support him as an artist. We can see here a couple of examples of the sculptures in the outdoor area of his museum, um, ranging from blatant ancient Egyptian depictions, where we can see gods and goddesses and very much emulating the style of ancient Egyptian sculpture, to more modernist works that employ his own language and his own approach to the Egyptian subject. Um, This sculpture of Ibn al-Balad kind of greets visitors to the museum. And behind that, we can see a couple in an embrace, which is very similar to an earlier work I showed you that's in porcelain. So I just want to return to it for a second. So you can see the difference in scale. The same work produced on a small scale that can be accessible and placed on someone's mantle at home is also produced on this really large scale that you can walk through in his garden. Another work here on the left, we see another Egyptian family of a rural background according to their dress, and they're all in an embrace. And so there is this return of a loving family theme. In tracing Hassan Heshmat's artistic journey, we see more than just a sculptor's evolution. We witness a visionary who bridged tradition and modernity, monumentality and accessibility, history and everyday life. Through his unique fusion of ancient Egyptian motifs, Islamic aesthetics, and modernist forms, Heshmat crafted a visual language that spoke directly to the Egyptian people. His commitment to making art available beyond elite spaces, especially through his revolutionary porcelain sculptures, marks him not only as an artist, but as a cultural democratizer. Ultimately, Heshmat's legacy challenges us to rethink the relationship between art, identity, and society, reminding us that art is most powerful when it belongs to everyone. Heshmat's legacy is being revisited today through the work of his niece, Dr. Sonia Hegazi, through this powerful exhibition at Divan that is co-curated with Katharina Raab, and through the incredible new book that they have published on the occasion of the exhibition. You can see the cover here. And you'll see, actually, if you manage to get a copy of the book, you will see that some of the images in my presentation today have been drawn from the publication itself. As the introduction mentioned, the book is the first monograph of its kind dedicated to the work of the artist. And it is in the work of producing such a publication and making it accessible that a new generation of scholars can begin to examine Heshmat's practice and evaluate it and rethink the relationship between Heshmat's own work and the art histories that are being revisited today. So I invite you to get a copy of the book and explore Heshmat's practice more broadly, and I hope that it invites further research as well. I think perhaps I can conclude here for now and open up for questions if there are any questions.
Does anybody have questions online or here? Yes, please.
So, Paddy, you mentioned throughout your presentation the kind of inspiration of Hassan Heshmat with the socialist modernism, or some way his artwork is portraying the different lives of common people, so-called common people. Could you tell a bit more about this sort of connection that Hassan Heshmat had to this kind of art direction or branch? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I would say that Heshmat was drawing from his own experience and from his own environment and his own upbringing and the scenes of daily life in Egypt that he was used to seeing himself. And he was making art of the people for the people. He was really thinking about his audience and sorry. As I said, he had this moniker of art for the millions that spoke to where he wanted his art to go and the reach that he wanted his art to have. And so in order to produce art that would be accessible to a certain type of people, he wanted to make art that they could relate to. And so he was producing subjects, again, like when we saw that feature of the dancers that were posing with him and speaking with him, the dancers similarly were also drawing from popular Egyptian culture. So like the popular Egyptian dance and the folk themes that emerge in certain rural environments. And these are recognizable themes within Egyptian culture more broadly. And he created that language within a medium that was most accessible. So while, for instance, artists such as Mahmoud Mukhtar produced national monuments that were icons and remain icons until now, they weren't the kind of thing that you could put in your pocket or, take as a souvenir from Egypt or place on your mantle until he produced thousands, hundreds and thousands of these sculptures at a scale that made it so that people everywhere or any Egyptian could afford and access his work. And so I hope that answers your question.
Do you have questions on that?
No, not yet.
Perhaps, dear Nadine, as I know that you made also some researches about this idea of museums that turn in, sorry, the other way around, of course, how private houses that turn into museums. Perhaps you can contextualize a little bit how Hassan did it and how it's seen in other artists' areas in Egypt.
Absolutely. I think that's perhaps um, a more broad aspect of my research that I didn't want to bombard everyone with in the presentation, but it's a great tangent to get into. I've done a lot of research on house museums in Egypt in particular, but in the region more broadly. And we have many. We have a tradition of house museums that dates back to even the Islamic periods. But in the more contemporary sense, as we know, house museums, there are many types. There are collectors' house museums, such as the Mahmoud Khalil Museum in Cairo, which remains probably one of the largest and most important collections of both impressionist and romantic and neoclassical art. It's a primarily Western collection, but includes a lot of important modern Egyptian artists as well. And then we have certainly artists' house museums as well in Egypt, including the Adam Hanein Museum in Harania, which he established as his own museum that, again, it was his house that he turned into a museum, but we no longer see any of the domestic traces. It's simply his collection of works. Similar to the Hassan Heshmat Museum, it also has an outdoor sculptural garden, and indoors it's kind of, you can see the actual works in situ. And then we have um, artist museums such as Hassan Heshmat's. The distinction I would say is that the Adam Hanein Museum is a private museum that he established privately with its own foundation, whereas Hassan Heshmat dedicated and bestowed his collection and museum to the state. And so it's run by the Egyptian fine arts sector. And then we have quite a few of those. So they're a handful. They're not that many. And they are also unfortunately disappearing in the climate that we're in now. There was a house museum that's recently been demolished by a ceramicist artist as well. There is the Aifat Nagy and Saad Al Khadim Museum, which was also their home, that was turned into a museum. Again, the traces of domesticity are removed, and we just have the works in the space itself. Unfortunately, when the state runs these museums, they tend not to be very cared for. And so they need a lot of care, like this, the state that the works are in is not ideal in terms of conservation, in terms of visitorship. I would say the one good thing is that Heshmat's goal in reaching students and for children to visit the museum is very much achieved in the sense that they still conduct children's workshops, and it's perhaps the one most successful element of the state's run fine arts museums. But when it comes to the display and condition of the works, there's a lot to be desired. And again, it's very unique in the sense that not many artists of this period produced this model. It would have had to be initiated by the artists themselves in their lifetime, and it would have had to also correspond with some form of archiving, which again, as I work a lot on this period and on the artists of Egypt in particular, there's not that culture of archiving and of keeping records of their works. In Heshmat's case, many records exist because he wrote them himself. We have the autobiography that he wrote, where he listed many of his exhibitions with details about them, compiled evidence of quotes of critics and things that had been published, and compiled the details of commissions and prizes, which again we trace now, but we have that record of his own writing to go on. Whereas in many other cases, we don't have that. And so there's a lot of detective work involved in trying to figure out the title of an artwork or whether or not it's an original work. And so the fact that this museum exists is really important in the sense that we can trace the authenticity of these works. We know these are works produced in the artist's lifetime. The works and the museum were bestowed to the state. Unfortunately, similar to the other cases I may have mentioned a bit earlier, there's been disputes with the state in terms of the amount of land that is allotted for the museum. And there's been a lot of back and forth. And over the years, there's been a reduction of the space. So it used to be a larger space dedicated to the museum. Now it's been reduced slightly in order to take back the land and give it to build something else. And so I hope that, the museum retains its structure and remains as is. But ultimately, these are the kinds of issues that we confront when it's a state-run institution.
Maybe I can also encourage everybody, if you want to ask a question in Arabic or in German, you're absolutely welcome to do so. We will translate it if it's in German for Nadine. In Arabic, she will understand it right away. So you can still think if there's something, this is the unique opportunity to ask Nadine. While I will also very briefly comment on your presentation, which is absolutely unique. And as she said, we're at the very beginning of research, and I have seen new sources in her presentation, and she has seen new sources in our book, and that's really only the start of research. And I'm very glad also, for example, I know that Nadine has a heightened interest in highlighting also the work of women artists and women's contributions. And that's why she is the first to have ever talked about Soher Heshmat. And I'm really very glad we haven't met in person yet, but we have connected 3 or 4 years ago. And I'm very impressed and glad that with what you presented today. So anybody who still has an open question.
I think
please.
while they think of any open questions, I will add something. There is a kind of thought that I had that I haven't introduced formally into the presentation, but the question of introducing Hassan Heshmat in context today, I think, was one that weighed really heavily on me in putting this presentation together because there's so many different dimensions of his practice to consider. And I tried very much to kind of go through the lens of thinking about his practice in the context of this exhibition in Divan to try to contextualize some broad themes. But there are many artists, I would say, that also would seeing his work in the context of their practice and in the context of that broader modern trajectory would also shift the framing of how we're seeing his works, both from a formal and from a political point of view. I think one artist that struck me in particular and is a point of future research, I hope, is the artist Fathi Mahmoud. And he was a sculptor who produced large-scale monumental commissions, but he's also credited with introducing porcelain factory to Egypt to produce plates and mugs and kind of like more, I would say like more on the crafts industrial side. And so it's interesting to think of that parallel between a sculptor who produced art for the masses in the form of porcelain and another sculptor of, a similar period who was also bringing porcelain to the masses, elevating it supposedly to a form of where craft comes to the form of fine art, but in a very different form and not in a more, again, like he's bringing porcelain to everyone's homes, but not necessarily in a high art point of view. So I think that's another consideration I'd like to introduce.
Yes, and now we have one question. Punkt ganz hinten in der Mitte.
I was just wondering about the larger kind of socialist context of the 20th century pan-Arab modernist art, where he fits into this kind of pan-Arab socialist modernist context. Especially, well, that's one question. The second question is also where he fits into the emergence of sculpture in 20th century Arab art.
Sorry, I got the first part, but the second part I missed.
Where it fits into the emergence of sculpture as figurative sculpture as kind of the 20th century modernist innovation in Arab art.
So I think to answer your question, where he fits into the pan-Arab nationalism, I think he very much does fit into that in the sense that he's producing art that is speaking to the people and has a very kind of nationalist and socialist agenda in the sense that it's of Egyptian subjects for Egyptian people and is trying to develop a visual language that's uniquely Egyptian and draws from ancient Egyptian sculpture, both in its formal qualities, but also in the kind of visual and aesthetic qualities as well. And that's a language that many modernist sculptors of the period were experimenting with to express the language of modernity in Egypt. And so he belongs to this generation and he has this agenda of, a sculpture for every Egyptian in every home. And he's working towards that. And that sense of nationalism really, for me, culminates in the quote I shared earlier by the Egyptian citizen who was at the exhibition. And Heshmat shares this alongside quotes from the most important critics and his artistic peers, again, like the most important artists practicing at the time, but he values this random Egyptian citizen's feedback as much. And this citizen is articulating the fact that Heshmat's work is bridging the gap between the ancient Egyptian heritage that Egyptians are so proud of and contemporary sculpture and giving them something, again, to be proud of. And so there's this sense of a direct connection with an Egyptian public, which again speaks to that sense of nationalism and pride. But I would say his is a more kind of Egyptian nationalistic pride than Arab nationalistic more broadly. But in terms of his artistic practice, for instance, we see that he exhibited in places such as Syria. He traveled regionally and exhibited and had commissions in the Arab world. And so there was that sense of solidarity in that sense within his trajectory and his practice and his commitments and his priorities. But I do think largely he remained Egypt focused in terms of his subjects and his priorities. And then where he fits into the trajectory of modern sculpture of the 20th century, I tried to address that also earlier. Maybe I can go back to that slide just to kind of give us a visual cue while we're talking through it. 1 second. So yeah, just to take you through it, he really does sit in the firmly within the canon of modern sculpture in Egypt. And I think, I mean, maybe I'm biased because I work a lot on Egypt, but I do think that if we look at modern sculpture in the 20th century, in the Arab world more broadly, I mean, there is a lot that's coming from Egypt, and there is a lot, even, elsewhere in the Arab world that is still speaking to what's happening in Egypt. And so he does very much fit firmly in this canon that begins with Mahmoud Mukhtar, who's developing, like the symbols of nationalism with monumental works such as Nahdat Masr. And, we have other artistic practices such as those of Gamal al-Sagini, his peer who showed with him at one of those first exhibitions. They're all drawing from similar subjects. They're all speaking to the same audience generally. And they're trying to depict Egyptian subjects in an Egyptian visual language that speaks to an Egyptian audience. And so we see recurring themes such as the ancient Egyptian subjects, the ancient Egyptian language, the falaha, the falah, Egypt as a woman, or or the average Egyptian woman. In this case, Abdel Badia Abdel Hay sculpted his wife. So there's a lot of these recurring themes within that canon. And for Heshmat, he very much sits within this, but then there's also, if I think about other themes within sculpture, there's the more abstract, there's the more geometric, there's the more calligraphic. And so I suppose with his practice, he did also experiment a lot in the sense that we get a range of techniques, we get a range of relief sculptures, for instance, we get a range of the wooden sculptures that he produced, the calligraphic works where he's experimenting with form and line and color. And so there's a lot, again, that he fits into within that kind of broader canon of 20th century sculpture. I hope that answers the question.
Nadine, thank you very, very much. I should also say that it was, of course, supposed to have the talk here, but we have been trying with an invitation of the Divan as well as Leibniz-Zentrum Moderner Orient to get Nadine, who is living in London, a Schengen visa, which was not possible. That's why we're having it here, an online version. But I'm very grateful for you to prepare this also for you as a new subject. And I look forward to further cooperation between the Divan, das Arabische Kulturhaus in Berlin, Leibniz-Zentrum Moderner Orient, you and possibly other scholars. And I think the second part of the evening is that we go downstairs now and Katharina Raab will give us a tour through the exhibition in German.
Exactly.
And then afterwards, everybody is welcome also to take a copy of the book that Nadine mentioned home, thanks to the Divan. Okay, thank you very much, Nadine. We will be in touch.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. This has been such a pleasure, and I wish I could have been with you in person, but hopefully next time.
Yes, next time we will seize the opportunity. Okay, so I think maybe Katharina and Dr. Lorenz will show you where the exhibition is and